welcome to everyone. I think I know everyone. I'm Lori Beeman, Principal Investigator of Non-Religion: A Complex Future. How to measure non-religion is a question that's perplexing us. It's perplexed, I think, many of you, knowing what you're working on. It's an ongoing conversation, and Peter's been working on this for quite a long time. In religion and diversity, he started working on it, and it's been sort of moved into this project as the central focus, as it became apparent that this was something we needed to continue to work on together. And so I think it's something that we're all sharing an interest in. And I'm really grateful to Peter and all of you who are working on this and contributing to the conversation, contributing questions, trying to sort this out. And of course, people like Jonathan Landman, the Understanding Unbelief project, dealt with some of this, but from a slightly different angle. So to use an overworked phrase these days, we're all in this together. And I'm really excited about listening and brainstorming and just engaging in these conversations. And so over to you, Peter. Thanks so much for doing this. And thanks to everyone for coming from far and wide, getting up early, staying up late. It's really just a pleasure to see all of you.
So what we're going to have is Ryan and I are going to do short 10-minute presentations, which are probably not going to tell you anything new, but just to sort of to get things going. And between the two of us, Ryan has agreed to go first, and then I'll follow.
I'm going to share my screen and launch this presentation. Hopefully everybody see that? That works. Yeah, okay. So as Peter said, some of this may not be new for some people, though maybe a little bit will be. But I want to cover some of the issues that our group has been wrestling with as we try and think through how to measure non-religion through this survey. And the survey has been distributed to everybody, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the actual items on the survey, just wrestling with some of the issues kind of behind what's going into the survey. So obviously, kind of the core issue here is, how do you measure non-religion, right? And I'm going to start with something quite superficial that some of you have probably heard before in the context of atheism, but often atheism, and I think you could do the same with non-religion, is compared to hair colors, right? So if we think of non-religion and religion generally as hair colors, then we have, say, Catholicism as redheads, and Judaism as blonde individuals, and black-haired individuals would be Buddhists. Well, non-religion would be the equivalent of being bald, right? It's not a hair color, and that raises all sorts of issues, right? So it's the lack of that. So where I'm going, of course, and I'm going to try and go from the superficial to something a little bit more substantive, is that in a very real sense, non-religion is some form of non-identity. It's kind of like saying, well, I'm not a Coke drinker, right? Non-Coke drinkers don't identify as non-Coke drinkers, right? That's not a core part of who they are. It's irrelevant to them. It doesn't really matter. Just like I'm not an airline pilot, right? I don't go around telling people and introducing myself as like, hey, I'm not an airline pilot, because no one cares, right? It's a non-identity. And in a very real sense, I think non-religion is that, right? That it probably is a non-identity, but it raises other questions, particularly this one, which is that non-religious people do have identities. They're just not religious identities, right? So when we're wrestling with these kinds of questions, non-religion is fundamentally a non-identity. It's saying I'm not those things, but most non-religious people don't see that as a core part of who they are. Some do, right? But not necessarily in terms of religion or non-religion, in terms of other identities. Maybe they're a humanist, or they're an atheist, or they're an agnostic. So if we can recognize that it is something of a non-identity, but we want to kind of wrestle with what the identities might be, then we can raise other questions like this. If what we're trying to capture is what it means to be non-religious, then what identities is religious affiliation actually a proxy for, right? So when somebody says I'm Catholic, what does that really mean? Like, what other things does it actually mean? Not so much that they're religious, but what is it actually standing in for? So we could ask questions like, is this capturing their understanding of nature or the world or the universe, right? So that may actually be what they're getting at when they say I'm Catholic or I'm not religious, is that this is telling us something about how they view the world or the universe, a worldview, if you will. It might also be capturing some sense of morality, right? That these are their morals or their values. Um, and religion is a shorthand for that. It's a proxy for that. So once you say, well, I'm not religious, we have to try and capture those things independent of religion. It might also be, and I think this is important to recognize, it might be an indicator of behaviors. How do non-religious people behave? If religion includes rituals, then and other behaviors, then maybe we need to think about how to capture non-religion through behavior as well. And that's tricky, right? That, I think these are really challenging questions. Could also be a reflection of just like, what are humans, right? So not just the universe, but what is the role of humans in this? So a lot of that's beliefs, but it could also be values and behaviors as well. Which raises again, and I think this is just kind of where I think we're going to go with a lot of the conversation today, is how do we capture some of these things? It also raises this caption: how do you capture someone's identity or identities if they're not religious identities, right? Which is an interesting question. And it also raises this one, which is, are there positive elements of the secular or non-religion, right? If it's just consistently measured or understood to be something that is a non-identity, it's what people lack, then how do you actually measure it if you're just trying to measure absence? So we've got to wrestle with, what does it actually mean to be non-religious? And I think there are some answers here, but it's challenging. This raises another question, which is, historically now we've thought of religion and religiosity as multidimensional, as having elements of belief, elements of behavior, elements of belonging, all wrapped up into somebody's religious identity. So if we're going to try and measure what it means to be non-religious, then we should probably be thinking about non-religiosity uh, the same way, right? Potentially. So are there equivalents for the non-religious? Are there positive beliefs that makes somebody non-religious, that makes somebody secular, or captures secularity? So that's an interesting question that we have to deal with. Are there non-religious behaviors? What would those look like? What would that mean? Very challenging question there. And then almost by definition, for many people, the belonging is actually not going to work because they're not religious. So there are clearly exceptions. And I tried to pull some examples that might make sense here. That, of course, we have humanist groups that people who are not religious may kind of affiliate with those, or atheist groups, or free thought groups. So there might be some belonging for some, but the research that I've seen and done suggests that this is for a very small minority of non-religious people, that they actually identify as having an affiliation with some sort of free thought or atheist or humanist group. Then, of course, we get into just straight measurement. And this is some of the other issues that we're dealing with. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time on some of the measurement issues. If we don't really know what the positive aspects are of non-religion, then it kind of almost seems like we just need to throw lots of measures out there and see what sticks, right? So if we're out, I mean, this is kind of whenever you're entering a new field or a new area, you've got to just kind of throw a lot at it, throwing a lot at the wall and see what sticks. So if you saw our survey, it's quite long. It probably needs to be shortened pretty substantially, but when you don't really know what it means to be non-religious, like what are those positive aspects, then I think it makes sense to kind of think about lots of different measures. And then there's this other issue, which I'm going to spend a little time on, and then I'll turn it back over to Peter. But it raises this issue of using scales versus single items. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about this. This is a discussion that we've been having kind of as our group, as we're wrestling with putting together this survey, the issue of whether we use scales or single items. My understanding, just reading the literature, is that lots of sociological research uses single items. Some uses scales, but scales seem to be far more common in psychological research and in some other domains in marketing, etc. Scales are basically a combination of questions that are trying to capture some underlying concept. Maybe it's depression, or maybe it's health. And of course, those have lots of dimensions. So using a scale might make sense in some of these areas. Um, With a single item, there are some potential very serious drawbacks, right? You get just one chance to capture whatever concept it is you're trying to capture. Your sensitivity, meaning kind of how much variation you really have in this, is quite low. So if you've got, say, one item and it's on a Likert scale that ranges from 1 to 5, then that's the full extent of how sensitive your measure really is. Whereas if you have a scale, you can aggregate that and suddenly you have a lot more sensitivity. So you can see a lot more variation within that item. And then, of course, with a single item, there are no internal reliability measures. You can get test retest reliability, but you can't really get internal reliability measures. So you don't know how reliable the item actually is. With multiple items, you actually have multiple chances to capture the concept, and you have chances to kind of cancel out measurement error. So there are some very useful, advantageous kind of components to using scales, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this. But to do that, I want to just briefly touch on validity and reliability, which for those who are familiar with surveys, I'm assuming a number of you are, and scales, these are core kind of ideas. So I'm going to start with validity. I usually start with reliability, but I want to touch on validity first, and then we'll talk about reliability, and then I'm show some kind of very rudimentary data to illustrate this. So when we're dealing with validity, basically all we're looking at is something measuring what we think it's measuring. And with this, because it's kind of novel still, I don't know that we've given it a whole lot of thought. But just to give an illustration, uh, I've had kind of a bone to pick with a number of measures over the years. One of them has to do with spirituality measures, which we're really not doing, but I'm just going to use it as an example. Here is an actual item from Chris Ellison's spiritual well-being scale. And maybe somebody will catch the problem with this, right? So here's the actual item. I feel that life is a positive experience. That item really has absolutely nothing to do with spirituality. It's a measurement of well-being. And what often has happened with Ellison's measure is he uses the spiritual well-being measure to supposedly capture spirituality, and then correlates that with well-being. And not surprisingly, when you measure well-being with his spiritual well-being scale, which is actually a measure of well-being, and then correlate it with well-being, there's a really high correlation. And then people are able to say, hey, spirituality is really correlated with well-being, when in fact it's actually just a measure of well-being. So you need to make sure that you've got valid measures. And I don't know that we've fully wrestled with the validity question here. And I think that would be a great discussion to have during this workshop today, to kind of look at some of the measures that we have in our instrument already, and maybe other instruments, and discuss the question of validity. Are we really measuring what we think we're measuring? Of course, reliability is a different question. The easiest way to explain this, I always use this, is like if you had a scale and you were trying to weigh somebody. So you buy a new scale, and the first time you step on that, you get 185 pounds. I'm American, so I'm using pounds, not kilograms. That'd be very heavy if it was kilograms. But then you step off and you step on again, and you get 112, and then you step off and you step on again, and you get 43. It's probably time to return the scale. It's not a reliable scale. So that's what we mean by reliability, is that's giving you the same kind of result every single time. Well, the advantage of multi-item scales is that you could have one scale, right, that gives you some, one item, right, that gives you some value. And then you could use a second one. And if it's close, right, and it's giving you relatively similar information, then you can narrow in and say, hey, maybe I'm actually capturing, at least reliably capturing, what I want to be capturing. So we could have multiple items here. To just illustrate this quickly, and I know I'm going over my 10 minutes, I pulled a scale that is meant to be capturing meaning, right? And I just want people to look through this really quickly. Hopefully everybody can see my screen well enough, and just look through these items and see if you would put the exact same answer on every single one of these, right? So that first one, every human being is responsible for his or her own life. So you've got from strongly disagree to strongly agree, 1 through 5. And then you've got whether my life succeeds depends solely on me. Our fate is in our own hands. I alone am to be held responsible for my actions and omissions. This is actually an autonomy scale. And then the course my life will take is ultimately up to me. Now, here's the tricky part, right? So on some of these, maybe you'll say a 4 or maybe a 3, maybe a 2, maybe a 1. If it varies across the different items, this is actually a good illustration of why multi-item scales can be very, very useful. If we just gave you the one where you're like, nope, that's just a 1, and so you end up coming out as saying just 1 on this, that may not be a fully accurate representation of where you really stand on the broader concept of autonomy. So that's one of the benefits of these kinds of scales. I'm going to give another actual illustration. Some of the people who were in another workshop, they saw that I gathered some pilot data related to one of these projects with the non-religion and complex future. I pulled some of that data just for this workshop to illustrate something. So included in there, I had the short version of a scale that I developed, the non-religion and non-spiritual scale. This is just the religion subscale, which has 3 items. So if you want to just look at those 3 items, religion is the most powerful guide of what is right and wrong. When faced with challenges in my life, I look to religion for support, and religion helps me answer many of the questions I have about the meaning of life. So we have 3 items. Now, typically with a scale, you combine those, right? So I actually add them together, divide by 3, and that gives me the mean on this, and that's, again, a scale. But what I'm doing is I'm using that as kind of a predictor, right? I'm not necessarily arguing a causal relationship. I just want to illustrate the benefits of scales, and I'm almost done here. And what I did is I set as the dependent variable here Schnell's scientism scale, right? So Tatiana Schnell has a number of scales that are meant to capture various aspects of what it means to be non-religious or secular. And this is her scientism scale. 2 of the items are reverse coded, so obviously I captured that. But so here are the 4 items. There are things that cannot be grasped by the natural sciences. Everything that happens is determined solely by the laws of nature. Humans are only a result of physical and chemical processes. There are things between heaven and earth that we cannot explain. I also, in the same survey, have a couple of single item measures of religiosity. So I'm just going to use one of them, but I want to do this to illustrate how you get varied responses using a scale or single items, okay? So on this next one, all I'm doing is just running a very simple correlation. There's nothing complicated here. Of course, those range from -1 to +1. And what we would expect, basically, is that the more religious somebody is, the less likely they are to fall kind of high on the scientism scale, right? That they're going to be less likely to say, oh yeah, science is the way to answer everything. So I just ran these correlations to illustrate this. I have an attendance measure. So this is just how often you attend religious services. And there's the correlation. So it's a negative correlation of 0.37 with scientism, which is a pretty reasonable correlation. And then I pulled the individual items from that, the NRNSS, and ran those individually. So the first item alone has a negative correlation of 0.42. They're all in the same direction. We're good. Second item, 0.47, negative 0.47. Third item, negative 0.43. It's all pretty consistent. But when you run the scale collectively here, we actually get a negative 0.48. So it seems as though the scale is capturing something slightly better than what each of those individual items is doing alone. So there is a reason to think through like, oh, maybe scales might be a good way to do this. They obviously have some advantages. They minimize error, but there are some drawbacks. They require a lot of space and time on a survey. And for all those people who have done surveys, right, you know that space and or time it's an expensive commodity when it comes to surveys. So we have to kind of wrestle with this issue. Is there a trade-off between space and time that's worth the improved accuracy of multi-item scales? So just wrapping up very quickly, when we're thinking about measuring or capturing non-religious identities, are we capturing non-religious identities or just identities that are not religious? I think that's an open question. It's an interesting question. Are those identities multidimensional? Do we need to be thinking about things in terms of belief, behavior, and belonging? And should we be including scale measures or just single item measures at this point? That's all I had. I'm going to turn it back over to Peter.
Okay. Thanks a lot for that, Ryan. I was hoping that our 2 presentations would be cut across each other, but that they would essentially be complementary, not the same. I didn't have too much worry about that because I am not a quantoid, and so I don't think in that level. But for those of you who are attending, I would like you to notice that I have a particular hair color. So perhaps this is an appropriate presenter for something about non-religion. So you'll notice my title is about the same thing because this is the same seminar. I'm going to try to be within my 10 minutes, and I'm going to talk about 4 themes, each of them relatively briefly. The first one is one that Ryan obviously also adumbrated, which is the operationalization of non-religion in a positive fashion rather than an absence. And then I want to talk about another thing that Ryan tangentially talked about, including religion-lite. And I'll explain what that is, probably pretty obvious. And then the question of what we've tried to do in the survey, a practical thing about translating the non-religion and complex future research areas into survey questions. We're doing that quite deliberately because that's the way the project is constructed, but there's also, as I'll try to say, there's some very good reasons for doing it that way. And then another question, which Ryan hasn't talked about at all, but I think which is very important, given this is a multi-country project, there becomes the obvious question of adapting the survey to different countries. Now, as for operationalizing non-religion positively, this is a technique that, or a conceptual technique that Ryan uses well. And that is, you have to back off religion and find a unity that will unite religion and non-religion, that where you can talk about both of them at the same time without already deciding which one it is. And for that, I use a variation of what Ryan used. This comes out of the religious studies, usually religious studies 101, where you talk religions have 4 components: code, cult, creed, and community. And so if we use those concepts to find out what positively we might mean by non-religion, then we're basically trying to measure values, practices, belonging, and knowledge, or similar words to that effect, without referring directly to religion and so doing it. So in the survey, the kind of the draft survey that we sent out to you, we've tried to do that, or we're in the process of trying to do that. One of the ways that we try to get at the values is, Ryan gave an example of that, using scales: humanism, scientism, naturalism. We're still not entirely decided, which ones we're going to use, but something like that to get at this values dimension. We want to get at social relationships more generally, and not just the ones that are typical of organized communities like atheist communities or religious communities. We want to ask what people do. And this is where actually the 5 areas, the 5 research areas come in. A lot of them are about people doing things in relationship to environment, health, law, migration, and education. And so that is a way of trying to get at that. But here I should stress that this is only one of many, many possibilities, but I'm trying to illustrate here of kind of steps to take to try to get at religion, this non-religion thing, positively, because the word itself has been emphasized often enough, really doesn't say anything other than what it isn't. We also have questions about cultural belonging, other kinds of belonging, and questions about ethics. Again, you're looking at the values aspect of it. Now, one of the things that keeps on coming up in these kinds of things is whether in trying to measure non-religion, we aren't going to get into what in other discussions has been called implicit religion, quasi-religion, cultural religion, or more broadly, ersatz religion. And the answer is no, that's not what we're trying to do, but we have to include those things too, because they're kind of at the penumbral, the boundary of, here as I say, it's the edges of religion. And so that boundary area we have to get at as well in order to have this kind of positive relationship with this concept of non-religion. So in that draft survey we got, examples of doing this are asking direct questions about spirituality and spiritual beliefs and practices. Again, what exactly those are is an open debate, and we're in the process. We ask about experiences, such as extrasensory perception or near-death experiences, things that are kind of edgy, marginal. There's a particular word for that that gets used that escapes me right now. We ask questions about beliefs, not just gods or gods, but other things that are in this kind of edge thing, like chi, souls, and things like that. And then, of course, questions about attitude towards religion, which asks the respondent to relocate themselves vis-a-vis religion in a kind of a negative way, but also thereby informing this edge aspect of the questioning. Now, the 5 non-religion to complex future areas, as I mentioned, are health, environment, law, migration, and education. In putting the project together, we decided on these very deliberately because we felt that these are areas where we would be able to find non-religion and thereby measure its effects, its presence, and all the other questions surrounding it. And so this avoids formulating questions directly with the contrast with a religion in mind. You formulate questions about attitudes, behaviors, belongings, and things like that with respect to health, environment, law, migration, education, which means that you're going at something without constantly comparing it to religion. And that also has this other advantage, and that is something that's very deliberately built into this. We can ask all or most of these questions of religious people as well, and thereby try to get at measuring the presence of what we're trying to find as non-religion also among the religious. Again, that's a kind of again, back to the edge thing that I talked about in the previous slide. Now, finally, different countries, different surveys. For those of you who live in different countries and who perhaps looked at that draft survey, you might find all sorts of things saying, well, not sure if that would work if I were to do something like this here, quite aside from the question of whether you or someone else would do it differently or the same. But the idea being that as much as possible, you'd want to put this survey together that where the differences might at most be questions of slightly different wording, but as much as possible, ask the same questions or else you lose your comparability. That's one of the reasons why we tried to incorporate, it may not be obvious, but we tried to incorporate some typical questions from international surveys like the World Values Survey or the ISSP in order to have that comparability. And in general, the translation for other countries is a broader question of not just language, but culture and concrete context, which is going to vary. And here I give you 3 examples that have come up in our discussions of this. One is the ambiguous status of the non-religious in Brazil. That came up in a recent workshop that we held about Brazil and Argentina. Then there's an example of politicization of climate change in the US. It's not nearly as politicized in other places. So thereby asking about climate change as a different kind of scenario and different kinds of factors that you have to take in consideration depending on what country you're asking it in. And then another thing that Kati and Inger brought up a number of times is what I'm calling here the non-religiousness of religious people in Nordic countries and probably elsewhere as well, such as in Great Britain. So those are some ideas that I thought I'd throw out here, not in the sense of trying to kind of settle the issue, but really kind of to open some questions, which I hope will generate some discussion.